He had made peace with dying alone. The ranch was quiet now, just the wind through dry grass and the whisper of old regrets. His days bled together like dust on the horizon, and no one had spoken his name in years. But that changed the morning she rode in, a woman with eyes like storm clouds and a past she didn't dare speak of. Her horse was tired, her dress torn, yet her gaze held fire. She asked for water and a place to hide. The cowboy saw the revolver at her hip, the scar along her throat, and something in his chest, something long dead, stirred back to life. He thought loneliness was his curse. He didn't know love could be just as dangerous. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The cowboy said nothing as he pushed the heavy door shut behind her, the wind catching its edge before it thudded into place, sealing them both inside the quiet gloom of his cabin. Dust swirled through the dim light, and the faint scent of old wood smoke clung to the rafters like a ghost that refused to leave. He watched her from the corner of his eye as she stood just past the threshold, shoulders tense, hat in her hands, mud drying along the hem of her skirt. She looked like someone who hadn't rested in days, like every shadow carried a name she didn't want to remember. Without a word, he gestured toward the chair by the fire, then set a tin cup of water on the table. She hesitated before sitting, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the drink, and when she lifted it to her lips, he noticed the scar on her wrist, a pale line that told of struggle, of something that nearly claimed her. He didn't ask. He'd learned long ago that some stories weren't meant to be spoken under a roof, especially not on the first night. Instead, he moved about the cabin with the slow rhythm of habit, lighting the lantern, stirring the embers into flame, and setting a small pot of beans to warm. Her horse was still outside, he knew, tied to the post by the trough. He'd tend to it soon enough. After he got her settled, she ate little when the food came, a few bites, her eyes flicking now and again toward the curtained windows as though expecting a face to appear. Every creak of the wind made her flinch. Every crackle from the fire drew her hand close to the revolver at her hip. He wanted to tell her to rest easy, that no one came this far out anymore, but something in her expression, something fierce and haunted, kept the words in his throat. When she finally spoke, it was not to explain, not to confess, but to thank him. "For the water," she said, her voice rough as gravel, trembling between gratitude and guilt. The sound of it hit him like a chord he hadn't heard in years, pulling memories from places he thought had long gone, silent nights of rain against tin roofs, laughter from a woman whose name he'd buried with the past. He nodded once, unsure if she noticed how tightly he gripped his cup. Outside, the last light of day bled into a bruised horizon, and somewhere far off, a coyote called, its lonely cry threading through the empty land. She turned toward the sound, eyes dark and distant, and for a moment, he saw something break in her, the brittle shell of someone running too long from the same memory. "They won't find you here," he said quietly, though he didn't know who they were or what danger followed her. Her eyes flicked to his, studying him like she wasn't sure if he was lying or just didn't understand what kind of men she was running from. "You don't know that," she whispered, her fingers brushing the revolver again, the firelight catching the metal. He didn't answer, only leaned back in his chair, the floorboards groaning beneath his boots, and let the silence stretch between them. He could feel it then, the shift in the air, the way her presence unsettled the stillness he'd built around himself all these years. She was trouble, that much was clear, but trouble had a way of waking up the parts of a man that had grown too used to quiet. And as the storm gathered its breath beyond the hills, he realized he wasn't sure anymore whether he'd just offered her shelter or invited something far more dangerous inside. The morning came pale and cold, the kind that stretched thin over the land like old parchment, every sound sharpened by the quiet. He was out by the creek before the sun had fully climbed, the same way he always started his days, checking the waterline, the fences, the horses, but today something felt different, off somehow, like the world itself was holding its breath. That's when he saw them, fresh hoofprints pressed deep into the mud, still slick with dew, the edges uncracked. Not his horses, not hers either. 2, maybe 3 riders, moving slow and steady from the ridge to the bend, following the same path she'd ridden in on the night before. He crouched there for a long while, tracing the impressions with his fingertips, counting the weight in them, the depth, the pattern of the shoes. Whoever they weren't just passing through, they were tracking, deliberate and patient. The kind of men who knew how to follow without being seen. His jaw tightened. He'd known this would come, maybe even expected it, but knowing didn't make it any easier. When he returned to the cabin, she was already awake, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around the cold tin cup, staring out the window toward the horizon as though she could see whatever was coming. He didn't say a word at first, just hung his hat on the peg and poured himself a cup of coffee that had long gone bitter. "There's tracks," he said finally, voice low. "Down by the creek. 3 horses, maybe less." She didn't flinch, didn't even look his way. "Could be ranchers," she said, the lie slipping from her lips too easily. He'd heard that tone before from men caught cheating cards, from soldiers before the gallows. Calm, detached, trying not to show the tremor beneath. He set his cup down slow. "You and I both know no rancher comes this far north unless he's got reason." Her eyes met his then, sharp and guarded, stormy as they'd been when she first rode in. "It's nothing," she said again, a little too quick this time, and he saw the flicker of fear she tried to bury. He let the silence hang heavy between them, the only sound the wind tapping against the window pane. "You got folks chasing you," he said, not as a question but as a truth laid bare. "I ain't got anyone," she muttered, rising from the chair, her hand drifting to her hip like instinct. "Not anymore." He studied her for a moment, the set of her shoulders, the way her breath hitched just enough to betray the lie. "Then who's following you?" he asked softly. She turned away, pacing once toward the hearth, the fire still weak from the night before. "You don't want to know," she said, her voice small but certain. And maybe she was right, maybe he didn't, but as the wind shifted, carrying the faintest echo of hooves across the valley, he knew that wanting had nothing to do with it anymore. Trouble was already riding their way. He walked to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to see the wide stretch of land rolling toward the hills. No dust yet, no movement, but he could feel it like thunder still too far to hear. She stood behind him, silent, her reflection flickering in the glass beside his own, and he wondered just how deep she'd dragged him into whatever storm she'd started. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "Next time, don't lie," he said, turning back to her. "I can handle the truth. It's the not knowing that gets men killed." She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told him she'd already buried enough truth to damn them both. The sun hung low and harsh over the valley, baking the dirt until it cracked like old leather, and the cowboy moved slow through the corral, brushing the dust from the horses' coats, his hands steady out of habit more than peace. The woman was beside him, silent as ever, helping to haul the water buckets from the trough, her movements careful but tense, as though every sound from the wind carried meaning. He didn't speak much, hadn't since sunrise, but his eyes followed her when she thought they didn't. There was something restless in the way she worked, like a hunted thing pretending at calm, and when the bucket slipped from her grasp and splashed her boots, he caught the flicker of pain cross her face, quick and sharp. She turned away, wiping her hands against her skirt, but he saw it then, the dark stain spreading through the sleeve of her left arm, slow at first, then bright against the faded fabric. "Hold up," he said, stepping closer before he could stop himself. She froze, stiff as a fence post, but not quick enough to hide it this time. "It's nothing," she muttered, trying to tug the sleeve down, but his hand caught her wrist with the kind of gentleness that still carried weight. The fabric tore under his thumb, revealing a thin, angry wound along the edge of her arm, a bullet graze, still raw, crusted with dirt and blood. "That don't look like nothing," he said, voice low, but she pulled back hard, retreating a step like a cornered animal. "I said leave it," she snapped, the tremor beneath her anger betraying more than she meant it to. The horses stirred at her tone, hooves shifting in the dust, and for a moment all he could hear was the soft wind moving through the mesquite trees. "Who shot you?" he asked, his jaw tight. She didn't answer, just pressed her hand over the wound and turned toward the barn, the fabric darkening further with every heartbeat. He followed her, slower this time, not wanting to spook her again. Inside, the light was thin and gold through the cracks in the boards, painting stripes across the straw-covered floor. She sank to a crate near the wall, breathing hard, the fight draining from her shoulders. He knelt without a word, grabbed the old first aid kit from the shelf, one he hadn't opened in years, and began cleaning the wound despite her protests. You don't have to do this, she said, her voice quieter now, thick with exhaustion. Maybe not, he replied. But it's been a while since I did something that mattered. The smell of whiskey filled the air as he poured it over the wound, and she bit back a curse, her hand gripping the edge of the crate. He saw then the truth in her silence. The bullet hadn't been a warning. It had been meant to kill. They're close, he said, more to himself than her. She looked up, her eyes glassy but fierce. Closer than you think. For the first time, he saw the depth of her fear, something raw and real, stripped of all her defiance. It wasn't just the wound that shook her. It was the memory of what came after, of the men who didn't stop until the job was done. He wrapped her arm in a strip of linen, hands rough but careful, and when he finished, she whispered, "You shouldn't help me. It'll get you killed." He met her gaze, steady as stone. "Maybe, but I've been waiting a long time for something worth dying for." She stared at him, torn between disbelief and something like hope, and in that quiet barn filled with dust and sunlight, the distance between them felt like a fuse burning slow toward a fire neither of them could put out. The night fell heavy, swallowing the plains in its vast quiet, the kind that pressed close and left no room for lies. The cowboy sat by the fire, the flames throwing long, restless shadows across the cabin walls, while she lingered near the window, her wounded arm wrapped tight, her face half-lit and unreadable. For hours, neither spoke. Only the crackle of burning mesquite and the low hum of wind through the cracks filled the silence. But there was something in the air tonight, something brittle, waiting to break. She turned from the window at last, her eyes distant, her voice barely above the whisper of the fire. "You ever love someone so much you start to forget who you were before them?" she asked. The question caught him off guard, not because of its weight, but because it came from her, the woman who guarded every word like it might cost her blood. He didn't answer right away, just watched as she sank into the chair opposite him, the firelight dancing in her storm-colored eyes. "He wasn't always what he became," she began, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Back then, he was just a man with dirt under his nails and a dream too big for the world to make room for. Said he'd buy us land one day, a place with a creek and wild horses. I believed him." Her voice trembled, not from weakness but from memory, the kind that cut deeper the longer it lived. But dreams like his, they need feeding, and when the land didn't give him what he wanted, he took from others instead. First it was cattle, then money, then lives. I tried to leave before it got too dark, but by then he'd already crossed every line there was. She paused, her eyes unfocused, caught between the woman she'd been and the one sitting here now. They called him Maddox Kane. You've heard the name. The cowboy felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. He had heard it, whispered in saloons, printed on bounty posters curling in the wind. A name that rode ahead of death. "You were with him?" he asked quietly. She nodded, the faintest trace of shame flickering across her face. "Long enough to see what he'd become. And when I ran, I didn't just leave him. I took something he'd killed for." The cowboy leaned forward, the fire casting gold along his jaw. "What was it?" She looked at him then, and in her gaze was the weight of something unspeakable. "Not gold," she said. "Not money either. Information, names, routes, ledgers, proof that could hang every last one of them if it reached the right hands. Maddox doesn't care about the law, but his men do. They're loyal until they're not, and what I took could turn them all against him." Her words fell heavy, like stones into deep water. He stared at her, understanding dawning slow and cold. "That's why they're tracking you," he said. "Not because you left, but because you can destroy them." She nodded once, her fingers tightening around her cup until it rattled against the table. "I was supposed to hand it over in Carson City, but I didn't make it. They caught my trail near Red Hollow. I thought I lost them." She glanced toward the window again, the fire's glow carving hard lines across her face. "I didn't." The cowboy leaned back, the weight of her confession settling like dust on his soul. He'd wanted to believe she was just running from love gone wrong, but this was different. This was blood and vengeance, the kind of thing that didn't end until someone was buried. "You could have kept riding," he said after a long silence. "Why stop here?" Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Because I figured a man who's already made peace with dying might not be afraid to help someone who hasn't. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the dark, and in that fleeting light he saw what she'd been hiding all along, not fear, not guilt, but resolve. Whatever came next, it wouldn't just be her fight anymore. The fire had burned down to embers, red as old wounds, and the cabin breathed in slow shadows while the night outside pressed close and endless. He sat there long after she'd finished speaking, her confession still echoing in the hollow places of his mind, stirring memories he'd spent a lifetime trying to bury beneath whiskey, dust, and work that never seemed to end. Her words about love, betrayal, and running from ghosts had struck too deep, scraping against the one memory that never let him rest. He saw her then, not the stranger by his fire, but another woman, years gone, with hair like wheat and a laugh that carried through the summer heat. Her name had been Clara, and once, she'd believed in him the way only the good and the doomed ever could. They'd built a life in a valley not far from here, where the grass grew tall and the nights were soft, until one winter, the wrong men came riding through a band of thieves looking for shelter, same as now. He'd sent them on their way, or thought he had. But come morning, the barn was ash and Clara was gone. They said he fought hard, that he rode for days after them, but when he finally found her, it was too late. Her blood was in the dirt, and the men who did it were ghosts before the sun went down. That was the day something inside him died too, something he hadn't expected to stir again until this woman, this runaway with eyes like a brewing storm, walked into his quiet life and shattered it just by breathing his air. He didn't want to see the resemblance, didn't want to feel that same ache rising from the bones of the past, but it was there all the same, in the way she looked at him, half wary, half trusting, like she couldn't decide if he was her salvation or another mistake. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the firelight catching the lines carved deep into his face, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of choice pressing down. He could send her on her way, come dawn, pretend none of it mattered, let fate finish what it started, or he could stand between her and the men chasing her, like he hadn't been able to for Clara. He ran a hand over his jaw, feeling the old scar there, the one he'd earned that night long ago, and wondered if this was what second chances looked like, not mercy, but the cruel kind of gift that demanded everything in return. She was watching him now, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, those eyes held something that stripped the years away, that made him remember the man he'd been before guilt had taken root. "You shouldn't get involved," she said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "You don't owe me anything." He let out a rough laugh, low and tired. "Maybe not. But I owe someone." The word surprised even him, and when he met her gaze again, he saw the flicker of understanding there. Outside, the wind rose over the plains, carrying with it the sound of something distant hoofbeats, maybe, or just the ghosts playing tricks again. He reached for his revolver where it hung by the door, spinning the chamber slow, listening to the click like a prayer. "Get some rest," he said, his voice steady despite the storm twisting through his chest. "Tomorrow, we start fixing that arm and maybe start fixing what's left of me." She didn't argue, just nodded once, and when she turned away, he thought for a moment he saw Clara's shadow pass through the firelight, smiling the way she used to when he still believed a man could outrun his past. The sound came before the light, a low rumble rolling through the earth, faint at first, then clear as thunder across an empty sky. He woke to it like a man dragged out of a dream he'd been waiting years to finish, hand already on the revolver by his bedside before his mind caught up to what his gut already knew. They'd found her. The air inside the cabin was heavy, still holding the warmth of the dying fire. But outside, the world was all shadows and frost. He moved to the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to see the faint glint of movement beyond the ridge, 3, maybe 4 riders, silhouettes against the paling horizon, their horses snorting steam into the cold dawn. They were fanning out in formation, trained and patient, the kind of men who didn't come knocking unless they meant to finish something. Behind him, he heard her stir, the rustle of blankets, the sharp intake of breath when she realized what the sound meant. "No," she whispered, voice breaking as she rose, clutching the edge of the table for balance. "They found me." He turned, and in the dim firelight her face looked carved from fear and regret. "You need to go out the back," he said, already pulling his coat from the chair. "Ride hard north till you hit the river, stay low. But she shook her head, grabbing his arm, her fingers cold and trembling. "You don't understand, they'll kill you. You can't fight them." Her words came in a rush, desperate, almost pleading. "You don't have to do this for me." He met her gaze, and for a moment she saw what no one had in years, the spark behind the stillness, the old fire in a man who'd once believed in standing his ground. "Maybe I don't," he said, his tone calm, steady as the wind before a storm. "But I've run from too much already." He slipped free of her grip and crossed the room to the rifle hanging above the hearth. The feel of it in his hands was strange, familiar. Like shaking hands with an old friend he thought he'd buried. Outside, a whistle cut through the morning, sharp and deliberate. The gang was signaling. He could almost picture them, faces half hidden by dust, Maddox's men, the same brand of killers who'd left his world in ruin once before. He opened the door a crack, the cold rushing in like water, the scent of sage and gun oil thick in the air. "You think they'll stop if I hand it over?" she asked, her voice trembling as she clutched the satchel hidden beneath her coat. He turned back to her, eyes narrowing. "No, men like that don't stop. Not till the killing's done." She took a step toward him, tears shining faintly in the firelight. "Then we run together." He almost smiled at that, a small, tired curve of the lips that never reached his eyes. "You run," he said softly. "I'll buy you the time." Her breath hitched. "You can't." "I can." He cut her off, loading the rifle with quiet precision, the metallic click echoing like a promise. "And I will." She pressed her forehead to his arm, the trembling in her body passing into his. And for a fleeting second, time held still. He could feel the warmth of her against him, smell the smoke in her hair, hear the rapid beat of her heart, all of it fragile and human and alive. Then the sound of a horse snorting close by shattered the stillness. He stepped away, eyes cold now, the years of silence and guilt burning down into something sharp, something righteous. "Lock the door behind me," he said. "And if you hear shots, ride." The last thing he saw as he stepped into the pre-dawn chill was her face framed in the glow of the dying fire, lips parted in a prayer he couldn't hear. The horizon was bleeding light now, and through it rode his past guns glinting, eyes hard, men who thought the world owed them everything. He leveled his rifle, the weight of it steady in his hands, and as the first outlaw came into range, that old fire, the one he thought had burned out with Clara, roared back to life, fierce and merciless, ready to burn the dawn itself. The first shot cracked through the dawn like the sky itself had split open, scattering a flock of blackbirds into the pale morning light. And in that instant the quiet ranch became a battlefield, the ghosts of his past roaring back in the shape of gunfire and smoke. The cowboy moved with the kind of calm that only comes to men who've made peace with death long ago, every motion measured, deliberate, the rifle an extension of his will as he stepped into the open. The air was sharp with gunpowder, dry earth kicking up around his boots as bullets tore through fence posts and the trough splintered beside him. He counted the flashes, 3, maybe 4 men fanned out along the ridge, one trying to flank through the corral, another circling toward the barn. They were trained, disciplined, not the kind of scum that spooked easy. He dropped the first one with a single clean shot, the sound echoing down the valley like a verdict long overdue. The second came charging on horseback, firing wild, and the cowboy ducked behind the wagon, returning fire with deadly precision. The rider tumbled, hit the dirt, his horse bolting into the sage. Another moved for cover by the well, muzzle flashing, and that's when he heard her voice cutting through the chaos, fierce and raw. She'd come out after him, ignoring his order, revolver in hand, eyes bright with fire and fear. "Get back inside," he shouted, but she was already moving, her wounded arm bandaged tight, every step a defiance of the death circling them. The world narrowed to gunfire and dust, the air thick with smoke that burned the lungs, the sound of their hearts pounding louder than the echo of each shot. She hit one of the men near the barn, the slug catching him in the shoulder and spinning him down into the straw. Another fired back, grazing her side, and she staggered but didn't fall, jaw clenched, fury keeping her upright. The cowboy saw it happen, and something in him, something primal, protective, furious, snapped. He rose from cover, firing 3 times in quick succession, dropping the bastard where he stood. The silence between shots felt like an eternity, the kind of silence that only death knows, before another rifle cracked from the ridge and sent him sprawling into the dirt. The bullet tore through his coat, missing his heart by an inch, and he rolled behind the wagon, breath hissing through his teeth. "You still breathing?" he called, voice rough. "Still fighting," she answered, her tone fierce, and when he looked up, she was there standing in the haze, smoke curling around her like a ghost come to claim what was hers. Together they moved without speaking, covering each other's blind spots, the rhythm of survival binding them tighter than trust ever could. The last man tried to run, breaking from the corral toward the open plain, but she was faster, her revolver steady even through the tremor of her blood loss. The shot echoed once, clean and final, and then it was over. Just like that. The silence that followed was not peace but aftermath, the kind that hums in the bones long after the danger's gone. The dust hung heavy, drifting through the golden light as the sun broke over the hills, revealing the carnage. Bodies strewn in the dirt, blood mixing with the soil, smoke curling from the shattered wagon wheel. The cowboy lowered his rifle, the weight of it dragging at his arm, and turned toward her. She was breathing hard, blood seeping through her bandage, her face streaked with sweat and ash, but her eyes were alive, burning with that same storm that had ridden in with her. He crossed to her slow, every step aching with the years that had caught up all at once, and when he reached her, she tried to speak but no words came, just a shuddering breath that said everything words couldn't. He caught her before she fell, holding her close as the light spilled across the land, and in the hush that followed, the only sound was the wind carrying away the last whisper of gunfire, leaving nothing but two survivors standing in the ruins of everything that had tried to kill them. The wind had quieted, carrying only the faint scent of gunpowder and blood as the first true light of morning broke across the valley, gilding the wreckage in pale gold. The cowboy stood amidst the ruin, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling from the echo of gunfire, every nerve alive with the fading pulse of survival. The silence that followed battle always felt wrong, too wide, too still, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting to see who'd earned the right to keep living. He turned to her where she sat slumped against the wagon wheel, pale but conscious, her hair loose, her eyes glassy with exhaustion. "You're hit bad," he said, crouching beside her, voice low, steadying her trembling shoulder. "Let me see." She shook her head, clutching her side. "I've had worse," she muttered, but her words barely reached him before a small satchel slipped from her grasp, tumbling into the dirt. It spilled open with a soft thud, scattering its contents in the dust bullets, a small knife, and a velvet pouch the color of dried wine. The pouch came undone in the fall, spilling a folded parchment that caught the sunlight just right. The cowboy frowned, reached for it, and when he unrolled the brittle paper, the world seemed to tilt. It wasn't gold, nor jewels, nor the kind of bounty men killed for out of greed. It was a deed, official and old, the ink faded but legible, bearing a seal of the territory and, written in precise, determined strokes, her full name. "This," he said, voice rough with disbelief, "this is what they came for." She met his gaze, pain flashing in her eyes, and nodded once. "It's not money they wanted," she whispered. "It's land. My father's land." The words came slow, heavy as stones. "Maddox Kane took it from him when I was a girl. He forged papers, bribed men, turned what was ours into his empire. My father died trying to fight it, and my mother, she never forgave him, or me, for surviving." Her voice broke, just for a heartbeat, before she steadied herself again. "When I was older, I found the proof buried in his safe, hidden behind the ledgers he thought no one would ever read. That's what I took. The deed. My birthright." The cowboy stared at her, the fire of anger rising slow and certain in his chest. "He hunts you for this? For something that was yours to begin with?" She gave a bitter laugh, quiet and hollow. "Men like Maddox don't believe in what's right. They believe in what they can keep." The parchment fluttered in the wind, edges stained with dust, and he traced the signature at the bottom, her father's name, bold even through age and weather. "You could rebuild with this," he said, glancing toward the horizon. "Take back what's yours." She shook her head, the faintest smile ghosting across her lips. "If he's still alive, he'll never stop coming. That land's cursed as long as he breathes." He folded the paper carefully, his rough hands gentle with it, then tucked it back into the pouch, tying it closed. "Then maybe it's time someone else put him in the ground," he said, his tone calm, almost quiet, but carrying a promise as clear as a gunshot. Her eyes softened, the fear there tempered by something else, trust, fragile and dangerous. "You'd risk your life for land that's not even yours?" she asked. He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them like the faint warmth of dawn creeping over cold soil. "Maybe not for the land," he said, "but for the person it belongs to." The wind shifted again, stirring the dust, carrying the faint scent of blood and mesquite into the morning air. Around them, the world began to wake, the horses restless in their stalls, the horizon burning brighter with each passing second. She leaned back, exhausted, clutching the velvet pouch to her chest as though holding the heart of her past, and he watched her with a quiet resolve hardening behind his eyes. The fight wasn't over. It had only changed shape. Maddox Kane wasn't chasing gold, and he wasn't chasing vengeance, he was chasing power. And now that the truth lay open in the dirt between them, the cowboy knew what had to come next. He'd spent years running from ghosts. Now, for the first time, he meant to face one. The day had worn long and quiet, the kind of silence that settles after too much blood's been spilled, when even the wind seems careful not to disturb what's left standing. The cowboy sat on the porch steps, hat low over his eyes, a cigarette burning slow between his fingers as he watched the sun bleed itself across the hills. The world smelled of gunpowder and dust, of endings. Inside, she was packing, he could hear it, the soft rustle of fabric, the clink of her revolver, the faint hitch in her breath every time her wound pulled too hard. He knew what she was doing before she said a word. When she stepped out, the satchel was slung over her shoulder again, the velvet pouch hidden deep within, though he could see the weight of it in her eyes. "You shouldn't stay mixed up in this," she said, her voice steadier than he expected. "Maddox won't stop. Not until one of us is dead. If I leave now, maybe he'll have no reason to come back." Her words hung in the cooling air, careful and final. But he didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow drag of smoke, let it curl up and fade like a thought too hard to hold. "You think leavin' fixes what's already broke?" he asked, his tone soft but edged with something deeper. "I've been alone a long time. I know what running buys you, just more miles between you and the same pain." She frowned, stepping down from the porch, the dust catching in the hem of her skirt. "I can't let you die for me," she whispered. "I couldn't bear that." Her eyes were glassy in the late light, her face pale but strong, and for the first time he saw not the outlaw's shadow she carried, but the woman beneath it, the same defiance that had kept her alive this long, and the same fear that she might not deserve to be saved. He stood, the boards creaking beneath his boots, and in that simple sound she froze, knowing before he even spoke that he'd already made his choice. "Ain't much left for me to lose," he said, stepping closer until the smoke between them was gone. "But maybe there's something left to save." His hand found hers, rough palm over her trembling fingers, grounding her like the earth itself. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the far-off hum of thunder. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she looked up at him, eyes wide and uncertain, and he saw the walls she'd built, fear, guilt, survival, begin to crack. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking in the middle. "After everything, why would you still choose this?" He searched her face for a long moment before answering, his words slow, honest, carved from the same silence he'd lived with all these years. "Because maybe I'm tired of graves being the only things I stand beside. Because you remind me there's still a fight that means something." Her breath caught, the strength in her slipping into something softer. "You don't even know if I'm worth it." He almost smiled then, that faint crooked ghost of a grin she'd only seen once before. "Ain't about worth," he said. "It's about what's left when the world's taken everything else." She looked away, blinking back tears, but he caught her chin gently, guiding her gaze back to his. "You've been running from what's yours your whole life," he said. "Maybe it's time to stop." The last light of day settled between them, warm and golden, painting the scars on his face and the weariness in hers in equal grace. She hesitated, torn between the pull of escape and the anchor of his hand. Then slowly, she set the satchel down at her feet, the dust curling up around it like a sigh. "If I stay," she murmured, "we'll have to finish this." He nodded once, steady and certain. "Then we finish it." The sun dipped behind the ridge, and the land fell into twilight, that quiet hour between what's lost and what's still to come. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of ghosts, only the warmth of her hand in his, and the faint, fragile promise that maybe, just maybe, there was still something left to live for. The morning broke soft and golden over the scarred land, light spilling through the shattered boards of the old barn, catching the dust in quiet, holy beams that danced between them like ghosts learning how to fade. The fire in the hearth had burned itself out, leaving only the faint scent of smoke clinging to the cabin's walls, a reminder of what they'd endured and what they'd left behind. The cowboy moved slow, steady, his body heavy with ache but his heart strangely light, the kind of lightness that comes not from forgetting, but from finally carrying something worth the weight. Outside, the horses stood restless in the early chill, steam rising from their nostrils as the wind stirred the endless sea of grass. He tightened the cinch on his saddle, glancing once toward the cabin where she stood in the doorway. Hat pulled low, coat buttoned high against the dawn. Her wound was healing, though she moved gingerly still, the stubborn fire in her eyes unbroken. She looked at the ranch one last time, the bullet-scarred posts, the broken window, the dried blood staining the dirt, and for a moment he thought she might falter. But instead, she took a slow breath and stepped forward, each stride deliberate, as if walking away from every ghost that had ever dared to claim her. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice low, carrying across the stillness. "Ain't no turning back once we ride out." She paused by her horse, hand brushing its mane, eyes fixed on the horizon where the light split the hills. "There was never anywhere to turn back to," she said softly, and he nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. The past was a graveyard they'd both spent too long tending. He mounted first, boots finding the stirrups with a familiar ease, and waited as she swung herself into the saddle, wincing but steady. The sound of leather creaking and hooves shifting filled the silence between them until she looked over, meeting his gaze. "Where to?" she asked, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. He scanned the horizon, the distant ridges, the faint thread of a river glinting in the light, the unknown stretching endlessly ahead. "Wherever the land's still honest," he said. She smiled then, the kind of smile that didn't belong to the hunted anymore, but to the living. He gave a faint nod, then clicked his tongue, and their horses moved as one, hooves striking rhythm against the waking earth. The wind rose, tugging at their coats, carrying with it the smell of rain far off, and the whisper of a promise neither dared to speak aloud. Behind them, the ranch grew smaller with every heartbeat, its silence no longer a prison but a farewell. Ahead, the land was rough and endless, wild enough to swallow everything they'd been and give back something cleaner, something truer. They rode side by side without words, their shadows stretching long across the prairie, and though the trail ahead was uncertain, it no longer felt empty. Somewhere between the rhythm of hooves and the hum of wind, she reached across the space between their horses, her fingers brushing his just long enough to say what both of them already knew, that survival had been an accident. But what came next was a choice. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time in years, he saw not the ghost of what he'd lost, but the promise of something still alive, fragile and real beneath the endless sky. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, painting the land in fire and gold. And as they rode toward whatever waited beyond the hills, the world seemed to breathe again. Somewhere in that vast silence, the cowboy thought he heard the faintest echo of laughter, a memory, maybe, or the first true sound of peace, and he let it carry him forward. The past had taken enough, now the road belonged to them, and beneath that ruthless, merciful sky, two souls who had once been broken rode on together, not as the hunted and the haunted, but as the living, bound by a love hard-earned and finally free.